Welcome to Tech and Tequila. For those of you who don't know about Tech and Tequila, this is one of our meetup events where we like to get together and talk about tech topics and drink tequila and meet each other. So welcome. I am Mohana Ravindranath. I am a correspondent here at NextGov. And I'm really excited to talk about drones for good today. So maybe it's possibly a different perspective on drones than you all might be used to. We have lots of very interesting panelists who are going to give you a perspective on what it means for the government to be using drones for good. So this is our first Tech and Tequila of 2017, but it's actually our 9th Tech and Tequila overall. And so I just want to thank our exclusive underwriter, Amazon Web Services. They've actually been with us from the very beginning when we started doing this in February. So thank you. So I'm going to kick it off. We're going to start with our first panel. We're going to talk about drone policy. So we have Hoot Gibson here from the FAA. We have Jennifer Richter from the CTIA NASA Council. That's the correct title, right? And we're just going to talk a little bit about the policies surrounding drones that allows the government to use drones for good. So if you can give them a round of applause. So I just want to get started by having Hoot clarify for us where drone policy stands today. What's allowed, what's not allowed? What is the FAA grappling with right now when they're thinking about drone policy?
Okay, well, in 5 minutes or less, I guess. Obviously, it's. I tend to go back to original. Many of you may have a background in traditional aviation, but the birth of that, I'm seeing a lot of the similar policy concerns and issues, although a little bit unique with UAS right now. There's a number of areas of contested space. We started out by dealing with it individually. We have two general categories. That's the commercial operators and the modelers, and that's by law right now. But those create two new unique areas. Obviously, the modelers are not out there for commercial reasons, and the commercial operators right now would be operating under 107. And then we have the whole category, and I saw my good friend here, Mark Bathrick, here tonight from DOI, a whole public category of operations that is its own expansive field. And when we get to drones for good, I think a lot of the work that's being done right now are in the public space. Hopefully get to the commercial here soon. So if you can operate day in line of sight under the 107 rule, you have your license, remote operator's license, and you're registered. That's kind of the basic ready to go for G airspace. We continue to expand and waive now off of that rule. So for night waivers and things like that, there's been a big growth in those requests. And we are getting more and more airspace authorizations, you would call it. And it's in fact, the pipe is really open right now to be able to operate in more controlled airspace, even up to Class B. So that's kind of where we're at. I mentioned to you briefly, we were on our path to move to operations over people, eventually getting into beyond visual line of sight and all that over the next coming years. But our ops over people came into a pretty significant discussion at the federal level about security and concerns about security. So we're going to end up dealing with that. I think that's been pulled back to the left, and we're going to have to deal with those concerns before we're able to move on.
Can you tell us about what those security concerns are? What are people most worried about?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we still don't, although we're very close, we still don't have all the authorities. There's Title 18, which Jennifer can tell you more about, but essentially, back in the day when we had aviation, people didn't like it and they took pot shots, so you're not allowed to shoot them down. UAS is now considered an aircraft. There's other things that are involved in that, as pen register, wiretap, some of the things like that that we would like to be able to use to secure unmanned systems. So you have a lot of that out there now operating, and we don't really have the authorities by law, although we're on the cusp of that, I think. And we don't have all the tools. I think it always came down to most recent discussions. There's going to be a 4th of July parade out in wherever, Topeka, and the sheriff, how's he supposed to know who's operating over that's friendly or has nefarious concerns on their mind? How do I deal with that? So it's a very real problem, I think, and so I think it's wise that we step back for a moment.
And just very briefly, I guess these regulations deal with aerial drones, aerial unmanned systems, but can you talk briefly about the regulations governing other automated systems and, let's say, underwater? Are they similar? Are they totally different realm?
I'm an Air Force guy that moved over to the FAA, so I'm mostly focused in the air. I'm aware of the amazing technology that they're seeing over there, but my job is focused only in the air.
But the regulations covering those kinds of drones don't overlap at all.
Well, I think the closest thing would be robotic cars now, right? Self-driving cars. That's would be very similar, and it has very similar concerns about safety.
That's right. And just from an industry perspective, if I can jump in there, you'll see that a lot of the automotive technology manufacturers are really looking at the technology they've already developed for automotive collision avoidance, for example, and trying to test how that same technology might work in the air. And then the question is whether the regulations, either at the FCC or DOT, will support use of that technology in an airborne fashion where it's already licensed for terrestrial. So it's a great question and something really to watch for, because I think the technology developers are interested in leveraging all the different kinds of use cases they possibly can.
And Jennifer, can you talk about some of the spectrum needs here that will allow sort of this burgeoning industry of drones? Like when are we going to see drones delivering our lunches every day, and what needs to happen until so that can happen in terms of spectrum?
Well, we can ask our friends from Amazon who are here about when we can expect delivery to actually begin. I think they're hopeful that it'll be in the next couple of years, and maybe their thought is that it could be in advance of the whole FAA UAS integration timeline, which really goes through 2020. I think their hope is that it will be sooner than that, and they're obviously testing in other places, and that's gained a lot of press. So the spectrum issues have really been a sleeper issue with respect to drones. Really, the drones themselves and the low-altitude traffic management system that's going to grow up to support them can't function without proper spectrum solutions specified. So we've been working on this for the last few years, and then last year the CTIA NASA UAS Spectrum Working Group started, and that's a group that I represent out of Aiken-Gump. They're all different drone communication functions that we need to satisfy. So, ground to aircraft, aircraft to ground, and aircraft to aircraft. And it includes the control links and tracking and diagnostics and payload communications, so if you were sending down real-time video or photos, collision avoidance, obviously that's a big one for the sense and avoid and detect and avoid technologies. Some of these will use the commercial wireless networks. It's certainly an appropriate solution because the commercial wireless networks cover the air from ground to 400 feet, which is where these small low-altitude drones will be functioning. And the commercial networks already exist, and the commercial networks already are used widely by drones for recreational purposes and for the commercial purposes within visual line of sight today. So it makes a lot of sense. But the commercial networks certainly aren't the only solution, and I think what our regulators are trying to look at right now is what spectrum solutions are appropriate for different drone use cases. So while commercial networks might be totally appropriate for ground to 400 feet, we might need to look at, and we'll need to look at aviation-protected spectrum, which for any sort of spectrum people in the room is a C-band, L-band, KU, KA-band, different kinds of spectrum that have been allocated by the ITU and the World Radio Conference processes. And that spectrum will be used for above 400, 500 feet, principally for larger drones because there are safety of life issues at stake, and so you need a different caliber of spectrum solution there. And then there are entirely different solutions for drones that will be operating in the stratosphere and providing service, broadband service, for example, in areas that don't have it. And there are a number of companies working on that. So there are a lot of spectrum issues to resolve. I think the good news is that at least with respect to the near-term cases, the small low-altitude drones that are going to deliver your lunch or diapers or pizza or whatever, the regulators are generally in agreement that the commercial networks are acceptable. There are some hurdles that we're still working through with the regulators on that, but there seems to be a general mindset that that will be the right solution for a number of those communications functions.
And can you kind of sketch out for us what those hurdles are that you're working on with regulators?
Yeah, so so from from an FCC perspective, I'll start with the FCC. The FCC really only has rules that prohibit a couple of the commercial wireless bands from being used for airborne purposes. So the 850 megahertz cellular spectrum, the spectrum that launched our first wireless networks, it can't be used for airborne, for example. But there's interest in using that spectrum because it's generally not highly utilized today, so it would be a good solution. But the bands that are generally used in your cell phones and your tablets today, 700 megahertz, 1.7, 2.1, 2.3, 2.5, all of that can be used for airborne, and so that's great. So we've got sort of a clear path on that. From an FAA perspective, what they're going to be concerned about is, can that spectrum be used safely and reliably to support drone communication functions? What does safe and reliable mean? This is something that we're working through with the regulators right now, because we want to make sure we scope that out and we prove that up to the extent necessary and enable use of these commercial networks for drones. And then, DHS has concerns about safety and security, so we want to make sure that these links are safe and secure. And so we'll be walking through those issues as well.
And how closely would you say industry and government are working together on the security side? Where are we in that discussion right now?
Those discussions are really just beginning, but I would say that industry and government are working together really well, seamlessly. I think there are so many great working groups that involve both industry and government around drones, and I think there's been a real understanding among the government agencies that they don't have all the knowledge necessary to reach all of these decisions, and that industry is very motivated to help study and provide solutions. And so there are working groups through NASA, through the UTM project. There's the Drone Advisory Committee, and they have a number of subtask groups that are working. What else, Hoot?
Well, that's primary, I guess.
Those
we have
two.
We have safety communities.
Oh, right,
that work,
right,
yeah,
safety
UAST.
committee, yeah. So anyway, there's really active collaboration, which is nice.
And can you talk again about the knowledge gaps here? You mentioned that there are some things that the government, I guess the regulators don't really know, they don't know enough yet to make decisions, regulatory decisions. What are those gaps?
Well, I tell everybody, we all get on airplanes every day or put our family and friends on there, and we don't even think twice about them getting where they're going. We've been doing this for decades and have gotten very good in the traditional sense. But that same community hasn't, developed in the unmanned systems and the communications and the other. So I'm pretty proud of the group. I mean, I've only been on the team about 18 months, but they quickly recognized that the answers weren't going to come from the building, and we had to find a new way to collaborate with industry. It wasn't just new information, but it was at a pace that frankly we've never seen. So things change monthly, where you might produce a new Boeing product every 20 years or something. So it's been significant. A lot of people pulled muscles trying to keep up.
Did you have any Sounds great. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the primary fears that you hear both from government, potential customers of or users of drones, and then also from the industry side. So what are people the most afraid of? What is preventing people from signing on to use drones?
I don't know in the sense of fear. I mean, I mentioned in the sense of security. If you're talking about owners, manufacturers, operators, they want to get to a business case, and I understand that. I mean, venture capital is going to dry up if they can't start, producing what they need to. And we're seeing a little bit of that, but I would say that's probably something that concerns folks. It's been, if you went to CES and some of the other great conferences, there's been a little bit of a fall off this year compared to the great buzz we had before. Since we're talking about drones for good, as I mentioned, I still think some of the public uses are very clear. I mean, rescue, first responders, law enforcement, those kind of things. I think those are very prominent. Remains to be seen on pizza delivery and burritos and diapers. Hadn't thought of that one. But related to that, and I've talked to our folks up there that it'd be nice to get on the side of angels, but blood delivery. And we get a number of folks that you can improve medical care and cheapen medical care and provide in rural areas right now that is very similar. You're just not delivering a pizza, you're delivering blood or samples or pathology reports. So.
And in terms of government users, then where do you see the earliest wave of use cases? Are the ones that you mentioned the ones that that government agencies are currently using? Are those the ones that they're most interested in? Or let's say you're going to an agency and an agency comes to you and says, how can I make use of drones? What's the first thing you say?
Well, I think it's kind of unbounded. I certainly don't think I have all the answers. I think people are discovering it constantly about, oh, we could use it for this, we could do that. Mark Bathrick, who will be up here in a while, has expanded the use in firefighting. But most of the things, frankly, in my past life, my previous life on the military side, a number of those things, not the weapons, but most of those other things in surveillance and the ability to give you kind of God's eye view, radio relay, all those kind of things are out there. And very useful for law enforcement or first responders or disaster recovery. So I'm usually surprised. People like to come in and talk to me about their new ideas and how to get started. And half the time I'm like, I never even really thought of that.
Can you give us an example?
I will, after she answers your next question. I'll think about it.
Well, really, the same question for you. I'm just interested in what the first wave of adopters are really doing. Does it tend to be more delivery or surveillance? Does it tend to be actually doing something?
The first wave of adopters has been surveying and inspection of oil and gas pipelines, of telecommunications towers, of the electric infrastructure, the rail system. These really have been and agriculture, and surveying agriculture, and that's really been happening worldwide. I think those have been the early adopters, and those are things that largely can be done within visual line of sight, and they're good commercial use cases for what's already allowed under Part 107.
And I did remember a couple, but I'm not allowed to say anything about them. So.
Okay. Maybe you can catch him offline and ask him later. Well, I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions, then open it up to the audience. What do you think is the coolest use case that you've seen among government users?
So just yesterday I was meeting with a client who is working on developing low altitude traffic management systems, sort of, building off of the work that NASA is doing in their research project. And they were talking about uses in Africa to take blood samples to faraway clinics for testing and bringing it back in areas where there are really no roads or infrastructure to do that, and previously it would have been impossible. So those are really pretty amazing use cases, I think.
I think the thing that I've had the most folks stop through now are the high altitude, almost near space, above 60,000 in that regime for surveillance, for LT repeaters, communication repeaters, all those kinds of things. So I think we're going to see some increased growth in that area. So rather than fly over your cornfield, we'll park one above Nebraska and provide that data down to folks. So it's another area that I think is going to blossom very soon. We've been focused on low. I think the high is going to be the next.
Totally agree with that. There's a lot of focus on the stratosphere operations and the good that it can do to provide services in areas that don't have it. You probably all saw some of the press recently about Dubai and the single-person transportation system, essentially, that they're testing in Dubai. That's an unmanned drone. So Dubai's been pretty advanced, I think, in some of the different use cases they've been testing. So you should take a look at what they're doing.
The cultures come in, though. I remember I was at CES last year, the big conference out in Vegas, and Michael, the administrator, and I walked up to Unique, who was showing their Jetsons version of a single-man vehicle, and at some point he said, well, where's the parachute? And I've never seen an Asian contort their face more like, why would you have a parachute? So, yeah, some of them are a little freewheeling, but it's interesting to see what they're willing to do out there. If I may, one paid commercial thing on Spectrum, too. Earl Lawrence, who's my colleague and kind of runs our shop, we always, when we first got there, we were very concerned about Spectrum, and it was going to crush us, and it's physics, and there's only so much. But we've almost transitioned now, because we got smart folks like Jennifer working on this, is data. Because most of the systems like UTM and the demand for exchange of data and use of data and doing things nearly real time, and all of us have phone apps that need to be able to update instantly almost. That is a very real concern right now in our building. And some of you know, I mean, we just went out for an RFI to work around airports with some real-time data. We had 47 responses almost immediately, and boiled that down to 6 companies that we're working with and partnering, as you said, in collaboration, because we knew we didn't have the ideas, and we needed the industry to come in and assist us in that.
And I just want to bring it back to the policy here for the people who are drone enthusiasts here. What kind of what should we be paying attention to in the next couple of weeks or months in terms of drone policy? What might be coming out soon?
How soon do you think flight over people might come out?
It's going to be delayed for a while now. I would say I've coined the little phrase that this is a year of security. So things are going to roll probably 9 to 12 months, I'm guessing, until we get the authorities and get some of these things covered that will give people some comfort. And then that process takes a minimum of 18 months, as most of you know. So it'll be a while yet. I think along those lines that security and getting through some of these other technical challenges, spectrum, data, but probably the need for security. And I also point out to everybody, every group, we typically go see like this, everybody's enthused, everybody supports the industry. There are other communities that don't, so I think privacy will continue. I think the state and local authorizations and laws that are being passed will have a big impact, could have a big impact on this industry.
And I think the thing really to watch right now is the technical development that's happening in the working groups that will support the regulation when it's adopted to have some expanded UAS operations. So you want to be watching the UTM work that's now is finishing up phase 2, and they've got some really interesting working groups around communication and navigation and sense and avoid. You want to be looking at what's the Drone Advisory Committee doing and their task groups and the things that they're studying and what they're coming up with. And so that's really where a lot of the activity is happening right now to then support the policy that Hoot and his colleagues will ultimately help us to arrive at.
We'll be keeping an eye out then. Do we have any audience questions right now?
I'm just curious about licensing. You've already talked about modeling, licensing, and so forth.
Wait for the mic, please.
I wanted to ask a question about licensing. You talked about modelers licensing now in place. Of course, you go into the stratosphere, you start going with other places. With civil aviation, commercial aviation, you license the people that operate the aircraft. Does the FAA look at doing that, and how would they do it, size, and so forth?
Well, I'm a pilot myself, but I think we're finally getting the point. I can remember the time when I was in the Air Force and was going to the FAA, and we had modified our training in the Air Force for folks with separate track and everything because, frankly, we didn't need them to have the same set of skills. They needed the appropriate skills. And so at that time, the FAA, I think, just convenience to some extent said private pilot. I think, as you know now, we have a remote pilot. And I think as we look at the vehicles, but also where they would tend to be operating in and around manned systems, then that level of understanding and expertise will change as well. So I see a number of layers coming out depending on where you plan to operate the vehicle and what the skill sets need to be.
I have a question about how drones can play a part in space resiliency. NASA and the government are trying to back up some of their satellite assets like GPS, communication, surveillance. How could drones be a backup for some of those services? And are there challenges like acquiring private sector data if some contractors are managing the drones? Or how can drones play a part in those efforts?
If I understood your question, how can drones augment or back up satellites as they decrease in numbers or capabilities?
They're planning ahead for war in space, so it's just a kind of a precaution they're taking. Like,
yeah, what
if a satellite blows up, or what if it malfunctions?
Right.
GPS communication and surveillance are very important services, and they want to have backups for that.
Right.
And I was wondering if drones could play a part in that.
Yes, absolutely. Hence my term of near space. You'll have the ability to get them up much easier than putting a satellite on orbit. So the ability to park them and use them as relays, it's being used now, frankly. We talk about it in, take a Katrina, when all the cell networks went down, all that. There's already plans to put, UAVs up over the disaster area and build in, basically be a floating or orbiting cell tower. So there's a number of capabilities you can get off that. So it's just that layer in between, and it gives you a lot of flexibility because you can put them up relatively short term.
And even at lower altitudes, the wireless carriers are now testing, and you probably saw some press on this, what we used to call cell on wheels. We called them cows, and they were used for improving coverage, wireless coverage on the ground. But now it's cell on wings, so it's still a cow, but it's in the air. And it's basically an aerial broadband platform. And so that, too, is a development that we'll be watching, and the carriers are certainly actively working toward for emergency service situations where service may go out, but they can deploy an aerial platform quickly and reconnect people to service. It's cool.
Right. Hey. So thanks for coming out. My name's Dave. I work for Measure. We're a commercial drone services company. My question is, maybe this is mostly for Hoot, but how do you think the Trump administration will affect the evolution of commercial drone-related rulemaking? I'm thinking specifically the executive order that 2 regulations have to be removed for every one that is issued.
It's funny you should ask that. Every Thursday at 4 o'clock we have a smaller UAS meeting, and I was sitting in there, and apparently I was the only person at the table a couple hours ago that didn't know that was a concern or issue, and I said, what's 2 to 1? What's 2 to 1? So I'm glad I participated in my meeting today. I usually skip it, but anyway, the short answer was, from our perspective, we don't think it's going to inhibit what we're doing at all. We get the idea in the macro sense that we'd like to reduce some of the bureaucracy, but in our aviation and the growth of UAS, we just do not see that as a big thing. And I'm not here to advertise for the current administration or anything, but the sense is, as folks come on, that I think it'll be supportive, because a lot of folks want to have innovation. They want to get some early wins, frankly, and some other things. So we're posturing ourselves. We think it'll be a couple hot years, but we've got to get this other thing under control, the security first, and then we'll be off and running.
I think we had one more question up here. Time for one more.
A lot of people I talk to really don't like the idea of a lot of drones flying around their neighborhoods and over their heads and perhaps crashing into traffic or whatever. Have there been any surveys about how popular, how desirable people find these commercial drones?
I don't know if Jennifer has. I haven't seen any, what's the word I'm looking for, but hard data. Reliable, data on opinions. We know there's a split because we see it through the courts. A lot of folks aren't enamored with it, or at least are concerned about privacy, as I mentioned. A lot of, I don't want you flying over my kids in the ballpark, that kind of thing. So the industry's going to have to, kind of stand its ground and give some areas, as local communities will have what I think are valid concerns. The flight characteristics of this is such more of a personal level. Folks still don't like airplanes, but it's typically around airports where you're affected. This could be, down the street. And so it's opening in some ways the old Cosby rule and things that when aviation was born, it's reopening it in a different kind of context, but it's still now more people are involved and more folks with concerns. But we'll continue to work through that, much as we did with the early aviation and through case law and kind of on an individual basis, frankly.
Yeah, and I would say that most of the companies that are very serious about using drones for commercial purposes would tell you that most of these drones will be flown 200, 300, 400 feet above you. They're really not going to impact your daily functioning, and you're not likely really to see them even. So I think it's kind of a non-factor. And then I would just add on to that the automation that is already present in these drones and that is continuing to develop is quite amazing. They're very sophisticated robots. And so no one will be launching service until we have, most all of these safety kinds of issues worked out, and the automation is to the point that the FAA can know reliably that beyond visual line of sight and for every kind of use case that it's safe. So I think that we are largely there, getting there, and then I think the low altitude traffic management system also that's growing up to support this is an extra fail-safe. So, so understanding the concerns that people have, I think largely this is going to be viewed very positively by the time we, get to the point where we can really launch this
You know,
commercially.
I will say, I mean, the FAA, to many chagrin, but we take the public trust of aviation safety very seriously. She touched on a couple things. It's hard right now to build reliability data. I mean, we are data hungry constantly, but part of that database evolves continuously as well. So we want to know about a DJI 4 or whatever it is. Well, they're on to DJI 5. And so trying to build that those reliability numbers as the basis of your risk analysis is also a challenge. So until we can, it's one of those things, how far do you stretch to collect data without, exceeding yourself and hurting somebody or creating a problem? But I will say also the industry that we partner with, the reality is the Googles and the others especially do not want to ruin their brand. They do not want an incident. They know it'll set them back, but the industry as well. So it's a pretty responsible group. Not to say that some yokel might not be out there, but as an industry, on the commercial side, they are very cautious.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have. I know there's so much more to talk about. I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Frank for the next panel, and I hope you will join me in thanking our first panel.
Thanks, everyone.